Hello and welcome. If you enjoy quiet journeys into the stranger corners of the past, you can like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. Tonight, we are going to look at 10 maps that seem to know things they should not know. Maps drawn before famous voyages took place. Coastlines that appear where no European navigator was supposed to have reached yet. Continents occupying parts of the world that were still officially unknown. A Korean map showing Africa decades before Portuguese ships rounded its southern tip. A European map suggesting an ocean beyond the Americas years before a European expedition crossed Panama and saw the Pacific. And, most famously, maps that have been claimed to show Antarctica long before Antarctica officially entered the geographical record. At first, these objects seem to offer a very tempting conclusion. Someone knew. Perhaps sailors crossed oceans earlier than the surviving histories admit. Perhaps older charts once existed and then disappeared. Perhaps governments guarded geographical secrets. Or perhaps some fragment of forgotten knowledge moved quietly from one civilization to another until centuries later it appeared on a surviving sheet of parchment without any clear explanation of how it arrived there. Some of those possibilities are entirely reasonable. Others become much weaker when we look closely. And this is where the old maps become much more interesting than the legends built around them. Because a map does not have to be perfectly correct in order to preserve something true. It does not even have to be based on a journey made by the person who drew it. A coastline might have passed through 5 different hands before reaching the surviving copy. A sailor could describe a distant island to a merchant, who repeated the description in another port, where someone added it to a chart. That chart might then be copied, stolen, purchased, translated, corrected, distorted, and copied again. By the time we see the final map, the person who first saw the coast may have been dead for decades. His name may have vanished completely. Only the line remained. That simple fact creates many of the mysteries we are going to encounter. Modern maps encourage us to think of geography as something fixed. We open a screen, move 2 fingers across it, and expect the coastline to remain exactly where it belongs. Latitude and longitude are measured numerically. Satellites circle above the planet. Mountains, roads, islands, harbours, and individual buildings can be located with astonishing precision. For most of human history, none of this existed. A map maker could possess excellent information about one region and almost nothing reliable about another. A Mediterranean coastline might be drawn with careful attention because generations of sailors had crossed it, while a distant interior could contain guesses, legends, oversized kingdoms, imaginary rivers, or entire lands that nobody had ever seen. That was not necessarily considered an absurd contradiction. The map was assembled from whatever knowledge was available, and available knowledge was uneven. A harbour used repeatedly by merchants might be known in remarkable detail. A coastline encountered during a single storm might be remembered badly. A distant country might be known only through travellers who had themselves heard about it from someone else. One part of the world could be measured. Another was inherited from classical authorities. Another was copied from an older chart. Another might exist because geography, philosophy, or tradition suggested that it ought to exist. So, before we ask why an ancient or early modern map appears to show something impossible, there is a more useful question. What did a map mean to the people who made it? It was not always a photograph of the Earth reduced onto paper. Sometimes it was a navigational tool, sometimes an administrative document, sometimes an argument about how the cosmos was arranged, sometimes a statement of political authority, sometimes a record of roads, mines, rivers, or territory. Sometimes it was several of these things at once, and sometimes it was wrong in ways that could survive for generations. This happened because maps copied other maps. Suppose a sailor reported an island in the North Atlantic. He had been caught in bad weather for several days. He knew roughly how far west the ship had travelled, but not exactly. Clouds hid the stars. Currents pushed the vessel sideways. The crew saw a dark coastline through fog, and later described what they believed they had found. A cartographer placed the island on a chart. Another cartographer trusted that chart and copied the island onto his own. A third copied the second. After enough repetition, the island was no longer treated like a rumour. It looked established. It had a name. It had a shape. It had a location. It was printed on maps made by respected men. The only remaining inconvenience was that the island did not exist. This is how phantom islands became part of geographical knowledge. And it reveals a rather uncomfortable feature of old maps. An error could become more convincing each time it was copied. The copy gave it authority. Authority encouraged another copy. Repetition slowly hardened uncertainty into apparent fact. There was another problem that affected sailors for centuries. Latitude, a ship's position north or south, could often be estimated using the sun or stars. Longitude, its position east or west, was far more troublesome. Without an accurate way of measuring time at sea, determining longitude reliably was extremely difficult. So, a sailor might know approximately how far north he was, while remaining badly mistaken about how far east or west he had travelled. Imagine what that does to geography over many voyages. One island can appear twice under different names. Two islands can become one. A peninsula can become an island. A coast can be pushed hundreds of kilometres away from its real position. And yet the same map may contain another coast drawn surprisingly well. This mixture of accuracy and distortion is exactly what makes certain old maps appear so mysterious today. We expect consistency, their makers lived with contradiction. There was also the simple physical difficulty of gathering knowledge. Long-distance travel was uncomfortable, dangerous, and slow. A navigator working from a ship did not study the ocean from a stable desk. The deck moved beneath him. Salt water damaged materials, rain mattered, wind mattered, darkness mattered. Instruments were limited. Charts could tear, become wet, or simply disappear with the vessel carrying them. The people collecting geographical information were often tired, cold, overheated, hungry, seasick, frightened, or simply trying not to wreck the ship before morning. A reef did not need to be precisely drawn to kill you. A harbour did not need to be beautiful on a chart to save you. For a working navigator, certain details mattered far more than others. The shape of a cape, the depth of water, where fresh water might be found, how a current behaved, what winds normally arrived in a particular season, which islands could be trusted to exist. This helps explain why some old nautical maps contain highly detailed coastlines beside interiors that seem almost casual. The coastline was where the danger lived. Beyond it, a mapmaker could tolerate much more uncertainty. And geographical knowledge was valuable enough that people sometimes tried to keep it secret. During the great period of maritime expansion, information about coastlines, trade routes, islands, winds, and harbours could carry enormous economic and military value. States competed for access to profitable routes. Pilots carried practical knowledge that rival powers wanted. Charts could travel through diplomacy, trade, espionage, capture, or theft. A ship seized at sea might surrender more than cargo. It could surrender information. A pilot could be interrogated. A chart could be copied. A logbook could change hands. A rival nation might suddenly acquire years of accumulated experience without sailing every voyage itself. This matters enormously when we eventually reach the Piri Reis Map, because one of the most persistent misunderstandings surrounding old maps is the assumption that the mapmaker must personally have possessed all the knowledge appearing on the page. Usually, he did not. Maps were collective objects. Even when one person's name appears on them, the information might come from dozens or hundreds of invisible contributors: sailors, merchants, surveyors, soldiers, diplomats, monks, astronomers, translators, scribes, prisoners, people whose names were never recorded. This is especially important because most old maps have disappeared. We are working with survivors. That creates another illusion. A surviving map can appear isolated and miraculous simply because the documents that once surrounded it are gone. The source chart was lost. The copy that corrected it was lost. The sailor's notebook was lost. The correspondence explaining where the information came from was lost. The library burned. The ship sank. The parchment was reused. The paper rotted. Then one map survives. Centuries later, someone opens it in an archive and finds a coastline that seems far too advanced for its date. The immediate temptation is to imagine a lost civilization. Sometimes the more probable answer is much smaller: a lost document. There may have been hundreds of them. This is one reason we have to be careful with the phrase "should not exist." Some of the maps in this video genuinely contain features whose sources remain uncertain. Others became famous because later writers interpreted their distorted coastlines as evidence of discoveries they probably do not represent. Some are genuine objects carrying false geography. At least one famous example is itself a modern forgery. Another represents one of the most extraordinary early attempts to compress nearly the entire known Afro-Eurasian world into a single image. And when we move far enough back in time, maps begin to behave so differently from modern ones that even deciding what counts as a map becomes part of the mystery. Yet almost all of them reveal the same larger truth. Human knowledge rarely moved in a straight line. It leaked. It wandered. It was mistranslated. It was inherited. It was stolen. It was improved. It was misunderstood. And occasionally, it survived, long after everyone had forgotten where it came from. The first map we will examine makes this process unusually clear, because for generations it convinced educated Europeans that a large island existed in the North Atlantic. Cartographers gave the island a name. They drew its coastline. They placed towns upon it. Other mapmakers copied it. Sailors searched for it. There was just one problem. No one could find it. And eventually, historians began to wonder whether the voyages that supposedly placed it there had happened at all. For a long time, the North Atlantic contained an island that was remarkably easy to find on a map and remarkably difficult to find at sea. It was called Friesland. On 16th century maps, Friesland could look substantial. It sat among the cold northern waters with a detailed coastline, settlements, and enough geographical confidence to suggest that there was nothing particularly uncertain about its existence. It appeared on maps produced by respected cartographers, and once it had entered the European geographical tradition, it proved surprisingly difficult to remove. There was only one serious difficulty. Friesland was not there. The story that helped place it on European maps became widely known in 1558, when a Venetian nobleman named Niccolo Zeno the Younger published an account connected to two of his ancestors, Niccolo and Antonio Zeno. According to the material he presented, the brothers had travelled through the North Atlantic in the late 14th century, long before Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492. The account was accompanied by a map. If the chronology behind it were reliable, the implications were immediately intriguing. The Zeno brothers would have possessed unusually early information about the far northern Atlantic, and some later readers would go considerably further, wondering whether mysterious lands described in the material might preserve knowledge of North America itself. For anyone attracted to lost voyages, this is almost irresistible. Venetian navigators, moving through northern seas a century before Columbus, strange western lands, a surviving map apparently descended from documents much older than its publication date, geography appearing before the conventional timeline says it should. But the closer historians looked, the less comfortable the story became. The map certainly contained recognizable geography. Iceland and Greenland belonged to the real North Atlantic world. Other features could be connected, with varying degrees of confidence, to places that actually existed. Then there was Friesland. Friesland was not a tiny misplaced rock. On maps influenced by the Zeno tradition, it could become a significant island, large enough to deserve attention and detailed enough to look convincing. That is important because we often imagine cartographic mistakes as obvious mistakes, a crude line, a badly drawn coast, perhaps a name written in the wrong place. Friesland was more dangerous than that. It looked respectable. Once a geographical error has acquired detail, detail itself begins to act as evidence. A complicated coastline somehow feels more trustworthy than an uncertain mark. Add settlements and names, reproduce the shape in another atlas, and the fictional place begins accumulating a kind of documentary weight. For someone sitting safely in a European study, there was no simple button marked satellite view to settle the argument. Someone had to go there, and finding nothing at sea is not always proof that nothing is there. That sounds peculiar until we remember what searching the North Atlantic actually involved. A navigator could be operating in cold, wet conditions with visibility reduced by cloud or fog. Winds changed the ship's progress, currents displaced it. Estimates of speed and distance were imperfect, and determining longitude remained one of navigation's most persistent problems. If a chart said an island should be somewhere nearby, and you failed to see it, several explanations were available before concluding that generations of mapmakers had invented the entire thing. Perhaps you had passed north of it. Perhaps you had passed south. Perhaps your estimate of longitude was wrong. Perhaps bad weather concealed the coast. Perhaps the map placed it incorrectly. All of those possibilities were perfectly plausible. And so the absence of an island could take a surprisingly long time to kill the island. This is one of those places where the physical experience of travel matters more than the clean map we see today. On paper, a navigator appears to move along a line. At sea, the line is an argument. The ship rolls. The wind changes. A current quietly pushes the vessel away from its expected position. Cloud cover may interfere with celestial observations. The crew continues working while clothing and ropes remain damp, and the horizon offers no convenient labels explaining which piece of land has just appeared through the haze. Suppose a coastline does appear. What exactly have you found? If the chart contains 3 islands and your position is uncertain, identifying the one in front of you may be less obvious than it seems. This created opportunities for duplication. A real island encountered in the wrong estimated position might effectively become a second island on later charts. A vague report could acquire a new name. 2 accounts of the same land could be interpreted as accounts of different lands. The ocean did not need to invent phantom islands. Human uncertainty could do that perfectly well. Yet the Zeno case contains a deeper problem than navigational error. Modern scholarship has been highly skeptical of the authenticity of the voyage narrative as Niccolo Zeno the Younger presented it. The supposed 14th century material survives through a publication produced much later, and historians have found reasons to suspect that the younger Zeno altered, reconstructed, or fabricated important elements. That does not mean every geographical feature was simply invented from nothing. And that is precisely what makes the map useful. A convincing falsehood is often built from recognizable pieces. Real coastlines can be rearranged. Real names can be misunderstood. Information available in the 16th century can be presented as if inherited from the 14th. A genuine family tradition can accumulate embellishment. And once all of this appears in the authoritative visual language of a map, separating inheritance from invention becomes extremely difficult. There was also a powerful incentive for such a story to matter. By the middle of the 16th century, voyages of discovery were not merely adventurous anecdotes. They were tied to prestige, political claims, commerce, and the reputation of cities and families. Being able to say that your ancestors had sailed into little-known waters before famous rivals had obvious appeal. Whatever Niccolo Zeno the Younger's exact intentions, the geographical consequences of the publication extended far beyond his family. Other cartographers used the information. Friesland spread. Gerardus Mercator included it. Abraham Ortelius included it. Through the work of influential mapmakers, a doubtful island acquired some extremely distinguished company. This gives us an odd inversion of how knowledge is supposed to work. Normally, repetition is reassuring. If several independent observers report the same thing, confidence grows. But cartography often contains sources that were not independent. 5 maps showing the same island do not represent 5 discoveries if 4 mapmakers copied the first. The illusion of confirmation can become enormous. One uncertain source becomes 2 maps. 2 become 10. Eventually, a later scholar looks backward and sees an apparent tradition stretching across decades. This is why old maps must be treated partly as family trees. The important question is not merely how many maps contain a feature, it is whether their information came from different routes. Friesland lingered on European maps into the 17th century before disappearing. The ocean remained unchanged. The paper world slowly caught up. And yet, the Zeno controversy contained another tantalizing element. The narrative included a western land called Estotiland, and later writers sometimes connected it with North America. If that connection were genuine, and if the claimed chronology were genuine, the story would become much more significant than one imaginary island. But those are 2 very large ifs. There is no need to force the evidence, because by this point we already know that Europeans really had reached North America centuries before Columbus. The people who did it were Norse. Norse communities had settled Greenland by the late 10th century, and voyages continued westward from there. Medieval Icelandic traditions preserved accounts of lands called Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. For generations, however, the exact relationship between those written traditions and physical North America remained open to debate. Then archaeology changed the situation. At Lance or Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, excavations revealed an unmistakably Norse site. Buildings constructed in a Norse style, ironworking evidence, and other material remains established that people from the Norse world had reached North America around the beginning of the 2nd millennium. More recent scientific work has even identified activity at the site in the year 1021. So the broad proposition that Europeans crossed the Atlantic before Columbus is not fringe history. It is established, and that makes the next map especially strange. Because the Vinland Map appeared to provide exactly the kind of documentary evidence historians might have wanted, the map entered scholarly attention in the 20th century. It appeared to be a medieval world map associated with genuinely medieval manuscript material, and on its western side was a large island labelled in a way identifying it as Vinland. If genuine, the implications were extraordinary. Here seemed to be a European map of the New World created before Columbus. The map was eventually acquired by Yale University and unveiled publicly in 1965, accompanied by scholarly study. The timing alone ensured enormous attention. Questions about who had discovered America were culturally powerful, and the map appeared to offer an elegant answer preserved in ink. Columbus had not been first. The Norse had reached the continent earlier, and here, apparently, was their America on a medieval map. The problem was that the first statement was true regardless of whether the map was. This distinction became increasingly important as doubts accumulated. The parchment itself was old. That initially sounded reassuring, but parchment and ink do not have to be the same age. A person creating a forgery can obtain genuinely old writing material. If modern marks are then placed on medieval parchment, Dating the parchment establishes only the age of the animal's skin, not the moment when the supposed medieval cartographer picked up a pen. Researchers therefore turned their attention to the ink. Over decades, scientific examinations and scholarly arguments continued, sometimes contentiously. Eventually, the material evidence became overwhelming. Yale now considers the Vinland Map a forgery. Analysis of its ink revealed titanium compounds associated with pigments produced in the modern era. Researchers also found evidence that strengthened the conclusion that the map had been deliberately created to appear older than it was. The artifact that seemed capable of rewriting the chronology of European knowledge of America had itself been produced centuries after Columbus. Normally, that would be the end of the mystery. In this case, it creates a better one. Because Vinland was real, a false map had been constructed around a true historical event. The Norse really had crossed the Atlantic. They really had reached North America. They did so nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. The forgery was unnecessary. That is an unusually useful warning about the way we approach extraordinary artifacts. Sometimes, an object becomes persuasive precisely because it confirms something we already suspect or want to believe. If the underlying claim is plausible, scrutiny can become psychologically more difficult. A map showing a Roman colony in Australia would immediately provoke enormous suspicion. A medieval map showing Vinland has a built-in advantage. We already know the Norse could have reached it. Eventually, we learned that they did. The map, therefore, feels as though it belongs. And the story of the real Norse voyages makes clear why the idea was plausible without requiring any mysterious technology at all. By the late 10th century, Norse settlers were living in Greenland. To us, Greenland can appear like an almost impossible edge of habitation, isolated on a map between enormous stretches of sea and ice. For the people living there, however, it was home. They raised livestock where conditions allowed. They hunted and exploited marine resources. They maintained connections eastward, though those connections could be difficult and irregular. Timber was especially valuable in a landscape where suitable wood was limited. The lands west of Greenland, therefore, had practical significance. A voyage did not need to begin with the grand intention of discovering a continent. A coast with timber mattered. A place with resources mattered. A route that could be crossed in a vessel already familiar to experienced North Atlantic sailors mattered. That is one of the recurring problems with the word discovery. It makes geographical encounters sound like ceremonial moments, as though a sailor reaches shore, plants a flag, and immediately understands the continental significance of what has happened. Human experience is usually messier. A coastline is seen, someone lands, resources are gathered, people return home, stories circulate. Another voyage follows, or does not. Knowledge may remain regional, rather than transforming the geographical understanding of an entire civilization. The Norse presence at Lens-aux-Meadows appears to have been relatively brief. Whatever larger journeys may have occurred, no enduring Norse colonial society developed there comparable to the settlements in Iceland or Greenland, and so knowledge of Western lands survived unevenly. It remained in texts and traditions, but did not produce a continuous European cartographic knowledge of North America leading neatly from the Viking Age to Columbus. Information can be discovered and then become obscure again. This is another modern assumption worth abandoning. We tend to imagine knowledge as cumulative. Once humanity learns something, humanity knows it forever. Historically, there was no single humanity keeping the files. Knowledge belonged to communities, institutions, families, courts, monasteries, trading networks, and individuals. If the network carrying a particular piece of information weakened, that information could fade from practical use, even if some written trace survived elsewhere. A Greenlander could know about Western lands, while a scholar in Italy knew nothing useful about them. Both were Europeans. The category tells us very little about what either individual actually knew. The same pattern will become much more dramatic when we reach a map made in Korea in 1402, where information about distant Africa had travelled across networks spanning much of Eurasia. But first, we need to stay in the 16th century, because European cartographers were about to face a different problem. Ships were returning with real information faster than old geographical models could comfortably absorb it. Java existed. South America existed. New coastlines were being recorded. Old authorities still carried enormous weight. Rumours moved through ports. Governments guarded valuable charts. Mapmakers tried to fit incompatible pieces together, and at the bottom of the world there remained an enormous blank. It did not stay blank for long. Cartographers began filling it with land. On some maps, that southern land would grow to extraordinary proportions. On others, a mysterious coastline called Jave la Grande would later tempt historians into asking whether Portuguese sailors had secretly reached Australia before the voyages usually credited with revealing it to Europeans. And then another map would appear to show something even more unsettling. A vast southern continent, centuries before anyone had confirmed Antarctica was there. By the middle of the 16th century, the southern half of the world had developed a peculiar cartographic problem. There was too much new information arriving, and not nearly enough certainty. Portuguese ships had moved down the coast of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. Spanish expeditions had crossed the Atlantic. The voyage begun by Ferdinand Magellan and completed after his death had demonstrated, with extraordinary physical cost, just how enormous the planet's oceans really were. European mapmakers were receiving new coastlines, new islands, new names, and new reports from places that had previously existed only vaguely in their geographical imagination, and yet much of the far south remained unknown. On many maps, that uncertainty did not appear as empty space. It appeared as land, enormous amounts of it. The idea of a great southern continent had existed long before Europeans encountered Antarctica. Classical geographical thought had encouraged the possibility that unknown land in the south somehow balanced the known lands of the north. The idea survived, changed, and eventually acquired one of the most famous labels in the history of cartography, Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. The name itself contains an important warning. It was unknown, yet map makers drew it. This can feel almost dishonest to modern eyes. We expect a map to distinguish sharply between observation and speculation. If nobody has surveyed a coastline, we expect the space to remain blank, or at least to be marked uncertain. Earlier cartography did not always behave that way. A map could represent geographical theory as well as geographical observation. A continent could be drawn because the structure of the world seemed to require one, while its exact coastline remained imaginary. That distinction becomes crucial when we encounter a French mathematician named Oronce Fine, also known by the Latinized name Orontius Finneus. In 1531, Fine produced a world map whose southern regions would eventually become famous among people searching for evidence of lost geographical knowledge. At the bottom of his world sat an immense continent. Its coastline was complicated. Rivers and geographical features appeared within it. It occupied the southern reaches of the map with such confidence that, to a modern viewer already familiar with Antarctica, the temptation is immediate. There it is, Antarctica. Except Antarctica would not be confirmed by explorers for almost 3 centuries. And this is where a cartographic resemblance can become a historical trap. If Fine really possessed an accurate map of Antarctica in 1531, the obvious question would be where that knowledge came from. The problem becomes even more dramatic when the claim is expanded, as it later was, to suggest that the continent was being represented without its modern ice cover. That would require not merely an undocumented voyage to Antarctic waters, but knowledge of geography hidden beneath, or transformed by enormous masses of ice. The implications would be staggering. And because the implications are staggering, the evidence has to be equally strong. It is not. Fine's southern continent belongs to a much larger cartographic tradition of hypothetical southern lands. Its existence on the page does not require anyone to have seen Antarctica. The continent was expected before it was discovered. This is a wonderfully strange reversal. Normally we imagine that people find a land and then draw it. Here, people drew a land and waited for the world to provide something that might correspond to it. There were intellectual reasons for doing this. Classical authorities remained influential during the Renaissance, even while voyages were forcing Europeans to revise inherited geographical knowledge. The ancient world had left more than place names and coordinates. It had left ways of thinking about how the Earth ought to be organized. The possibility of a large southern landmass fitted comfortably within some of those expectations. So when a Renaissance mapmaker placed Terra Australis in the south, the coastline could acquire impressive detail without that detail representing a surveyed shore. A hypothetical continent does not have to look hypothetical. That single idea explains much of the supposed mystery surrounding Fine's map. But it also reveals something more interesting about the people making these objects. They were trying to construct complete worlds from incomplete evidence. That is an uncomfortable task. Imagine the practical problem without imagining any individual conversation. A mapmaker has several sources spread before him. One contains information inherited from Ptolemy. Another reflects newer Portuguese voyages. Place names arrive from travellers. Islands appear in accounts whose positions are uncertain. Different charts use different scales. Reports contradict one another. And somehow, all of it must fit onto one surface. There is no international geographical database waiting to resolve disagreements. There is no photograph of the planet against which the final drawing can be checked. There are only sources. Some are excellent. Some are obsolete. Some are misunderstood. Some are probably rumours. And the mapmaker may not know which is which. This is why old maps can produce such unsettling combinations. One portion can preserve genuine maritime intelligence, while another is shaped by theory. A real island may sit beside an imaginary coast. Accurate place names can be attached to distorted geography. The map is neither simply true nor simply false. It is an argument made from fragments, and the fragments continued arriving. In the same century that Fine drew his enormous southern continent, a remarkable group of maps began appearing in the French port of Dieppe. Today, they are known collectively as the Dieppe maps. They were elaborate manuscript maps, often large, richly decorated, and visually impressive. They reflected a world transformed by Iberian exploration, and many of the names appearing on them reveal the influence of Portuguese geographical knowledge. This alone makes them historically fascinating. Portugal had spent generations pushing maritime exploration down the African coast and into the Indian Ocean. Portuguese sailors and pilots operated through networks connecting Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and eventually territories much farther east. Geographical information gathered within this system was valuable. A coastline was not simply an intellectual discovery. It could be commercial intelligence. Knowing where a harbour lay, where a reef threatened a vessel, where spices could be obtained, or which route led safely through unfamiliar waters, could translate directly into money and power. States, therefore, had reasons to protect maritime information. But secrets carried aboard ships are difficult to keep perfectly secret. Sailors change employers. Maps are copied. Ships are captured. Merchants talk. Diplomats travel. Foreign cartographers gain access to material produced elsewhere. A government can attempt to control geographical knowledge without being able to prevent it from leaking. The Dieppe map makers appear to have benefited from information originating in Portuguese exploration, even though they were working in France. And on several of their maps, south of the islands of Southeast Asia, appears one of the most controversial geographical shapes in early modern cartography. Jave la Grande, Great Java. It is large, very large. Its coastline stretches southward in a way that, over the centuries, has encouraged a tantalizing question. Could this actually be Australia? If so, the historical implications would be substantial. Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon is generally associated with the first documented European landing on the Australian continent in 1606. Other Dutch voyages followed, gradually placing more of Australia's coastline onto European maps. But the Dieppe maps were made decades earlier. If Jave la Grande represents Australia, then somebody had information before the documented Dutch encounters. The most obvious candidates would be Portuguese navigators. By the early 16th century, Portuguese maritime networks had reached Southeast Asia. After the capture of Malacca in 1511, Portuguese activity brought sailors into a region from which northern Australia was no longer unimaginably distant. There is nothing technologically impossible about a Portuguese vessel reaching Australian waters during this period. That point matters. The Portuguese discovery hypothesis does not require an advanced lost civilization, impossible navigation, or ancient global surveying. It requires an undocumented or poorly documented voyage by sailors already operating in the general region. Historically, that is plausible. But plausible is not the same as demonstrated. And the Dieppe maps do not provide the clean evidence we might wish they did. The problem begins with the coastline itself. People who support the Australian interpretation have compared parts of Jave la Grande with sections of Australia's coast. Certain bays, protrusions, and broad shapes can appear suggestive, especially when the old map is rotated, stretched, or otherwise adjusted to fit modern geography. This is where visual evidence becomes dangerous. Human beings are extremely good at finding patterns. Give us two complicated coastlines and enough freedom to rotate or distort one of them, and similarities begin to emerge. The important test is not whether a few features can be made to correspond. It is whether the identification explains the whole map better than competing explanations do. And here, the case becomes much weaker. Researchers skeptical of the Australia interpretation have pointed toward the geographical traditions surrounding Java itself. European understanding of Southeast Asia remained imperfect. Marco Polo's descriptions had contributed to the idea of Java Major, a very large Java, and cartographers working with uncertain information could expand, displace, or combine geographical features. A coastline can become enormous without representing a secretly discovered continent. This sounds almost too simple until we remember how geographical size was actually estimated. If you sail along part of a coast without knowing precisely where you are, the relationship between distance travelled and the shape eventually drawn on a map can become distorted. Add copied material, inconsistent scales, uncertain longitude, and descriptions inherited from older texts, and familiar lands can expand dramatically. There was also the persistent southern continent problem. A mapmaker, already expecting substantial land in the south, had a conceptual place into which uncertain geography could grow. Java did not exist in isolation from Terra Australis. The known, the reported, and the expected could blend. This makes Jave la Grande much harder to identify than it first appears. It may preserve some genuine geographical information from Portuguese activity in Southeast Asia. That does not automatically make the large southern coastline Australia, and the names written along it do not provide a decisive solution. If Portuguese explorers had systematically charted Australia, we might hope to find a pattern of place names or geographical details that connects convincingly with actual Australian features. Instead, the evidence remains ambiguous. For centuries, historians have argued over it. And perhaps the most useful thing about the debate is not deciding that one side possesses a secret answer. It is recognizing how close early modern mapmaking could bring genuine information and geographical imagination together. The people involved were not foolish. They were working at the edge of what could be known. That edge was physically uncomfortable. The polished map in a modern collection hides the conditions under which much of its information originated. Before a coastline became a line of ink, somebody often had to survive the coastline. A vessel approaching unfamiliar land had no advanced certainty about what lay beneath the water. Reefs and shoals could remain invisible until dangerously close. A promising bay might offer no safe anchorage. Fresh water might be difficult to find. Winds that carried a ship toward a coast could make leaving it much harder. And every day spent exploring created another logistical problem. Food was finite. Water was finite. Rigging wore out. Hull maintenance continued. Crew members became ill. The farther a voyage moved from established supply networks, the more expensive curiosity became. This helps explain why early exploration could be fragmentary. A ship might encounter a coastline without surveying all of it. A crew could land briefly, gather what it needed, and leave. A pilot might record only the features relevant to navigation. Another vessel could encounter a different section years later without realizing that both belonged to the same enormous landmass. The resulting map would not emerge in one glorious moment. It would accumulate. That process becomes particularly important when trying to decide who discovered a continent. Australia is a good example because its geographical knowledge developed through many different human traditions. Indigenous Australians had lived across the continent for tens of thousands of years before any European mapmaker attempted to place its coastline on paper. From their perspective, the idea that Australia waited to be discovered by a European ship is obviously inadequate. European cartographic knowledge of the continent was the new thing. The land was not. This distinction is easy to lose when maps become the centre of the story. A blank area on a European map did not mean an empty world. It meant an empty space in a particular information system. The same is true elsewhere. When medieval Europeans lacked detailed knowledge of distant Asian geography, millions of people still lived there. When a Korean map represented Europe imperfectly, Europe did not become less real. Maps show the limits of their makers' networks, not the limits of human existence. And sometimes those networks reach surprisingly far. That is why the Dieppe maps remain worth studying, even if Jave la Grande is not accepted as proof of a Portuguese discovery of Australia. They reveal information moving across political boundaries, Portuguese knowledge entering French cartography, medieval descriptions surviving into a period of oceanic exploration, old ideas being forced to coexist with new observations. And throughout it all, the southern world remained unusually flexible. For a mapmaker, there was a practical temptation to connect things, an uncertain coastline here, an expected continent there, a large island described in an authoritative old text, a newly reported cape. Once connected on paper, separate uncertainties could become one enormous landmass. The finished result might look deliberate and confident. Its ingredients were anything but. Oronce finds southern continent demonstrates the same principle on a grander scale. His Terra Australis was not a faint question mark at the edge of the world. It was monumental. And because we now know that a monumental continent really does occupy the far south, the coincidence feels more meaningful than it necessarily is. Antarctica is there. Vine drew a southern continent. Therefore, it is easy to feel that Fine somehow knew Antarctica was there. But this reverses the historical reasoning. People had proposed southern lands before they had evidence of Antarctica. Different mapmakers gave those hypothetical lands different shapes. If one of those shapes later resembles part of a real southern continent, resemblance alone cannot tell us how it was produced. There is an even more basic problem with the famous ice-free Antarctica interpretation. Antarctica is not simply a familiar continent concealed beneath a thin white covering. Its enormous ice sheets profoundly affect the coastline we see today. Remove the ice and the relationship between land, sea level, and the underlying terrain becomes complicated. Some areas of the bedrock lie below sea level. The continent without its ice would not simply present itself as the neat outline sometimes claimed in popular comparisons with Renaissance maps. So, the idea that Fine possessed a precise ancient survey of an ice-free Antarctic coastline asks the map to provide much more information than it actually does. The mysterious continent becomes less mysterious, but it does not become less fascinating. Quite the opposite. Fine's map preserves a moment when geography was being pulled in two directions. Behind the mapmaker stood centuries of inherited cosmology and classical authority. Beyond him came sailors with observations that would eventually destroy or transform parts of that inheritance. He lived between those worlds. A continent could still exist because reason suggested it should. Soon, ships would begin testing the edges of that assumption. For a long time, they found fragments of southern land without understanding the whole. Tierra del Fuego raised questions about whether it might belong to a larger southern continent. Australia would gradually emerge through European voyages without immediately being understood in its full form. New Zealand would complicate the southern geography further. Voyagers would search for Terra Australis long after the theoretical continent had begun shrinking. Eventually, Antarctica itself would be encountered. But when that happened, it did not vindicate every earlier southern continent drawn on every map. A correct guess about the existence of land is not the same thing as knowledge of that land. This distinction will matter again, because one of the maps we are approaching contains a geographical feature much harder to dismiss as a theoretical southern continent. It was printed in 1507. Its creator was a German cartographer working far from the newly explored shores of the Americas. On his enormous world map, the new western lands appeared as a continent separated from Asia. He gave part of that land a name that would survive long after his own doubts about it: America. But the name is not the strangest thing on the map. Along the western side of the new continent, Waldseemüller left room for an ocean. This was 6 years before Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and became the first recorded European to see the Pacific from the Americas, and 13 years before Magellan's expedition found the passage into that ocean far to the south. This time, the mapmaker's source is not so easily explained. Something had changed. We have reached one of the few places in this story where, after the exaggerations are removed and the impossible claims are stripped away, a genuine historical question remains. In 1507, in a small town in the mountains of northeastern France, a group of scholars attempted to redraw the world. They were not working in Lisbon, where Portuguese ships returned from Africa and India. They were not in Seville, connected directly to Spain's Atlantic Empire. They were hundreds of kilometers from the sea, in Saint-Dié, in Lorraine. Yet one of the men working there, Martin Waldseemüller, would produce a map that seems, in one particular respect, to have arrived too early. The map was enormous. Printed from 12 separate wood blocks and assembled into a single world image, it measured roughly 4.5 feet high and 8 feet wide. It was designed to be seen, studied, and perhaps argued over. Across its surface, the geographical inheritance of the ancient world collided with information arriving from recent voyages. Europe, Africa, and Asia occupied their familiar places. Then, on the far side of the Atlantic, something different appeared. A new continent, and written across part of it was a new name: America. This is the map most often credited with introducing that name to the geographical world. The story behind the word begins with Amerigo Vespucci, the Florentine navigator, whose accounts helped persuade some European scholars that the lands encountered across the Atlantic were not simply the eastern outskirts of Asia. They represented something else. A separate part of the world. This was not immediately obvious after Columbus's first voyage. Columbus himself remained committed to the belief that he had reached regions associated with Asia. From the European perspective of the late 15th century, this was not an absurd conclusion. Sail west across the ocean sea, reach land, and the inherited geography of the period offered Asia as the obvious explanation. The problem was that new voyages kept producing more coastline, too much coastline. South America extended enormously to the south. Reports from explorers did not fit comfortably into the geography Europeans expected to find on the eastern edge of Asia. Gradually, a different possibility became harder to avoid. Perhaps these lands were not Asia at all. Waldseemüller and the scholars around him embraced that interpretation. In an accompanying geographical work, the Cosmographiae Introductio, the new land, was associated with Vespucci, and the name America was proposed. The choice was almost casual compared with its consequences. Europe had a feminine Latin form. Asia did. Africa did. So the newly recognized fourth part of the world could become America, after Americus, the Latinized form of Amerigo. A name was printed. The name spread. And eventually hundreds of millions of people would live inside geographical identities derived from it. North America, South America, the Americas. All from a naming decision made while Europeans were still deeply uncertain about what the land actually was. Waldseemüller himself seems to have become less certain. In later work, he stopped using the name America. But maps have a peculiar independence from their makers. Once printed and copied, geographical information can escape the intentions of the person who first placed it on the page. The word survived its creator's hesitation. That alone would make the 1507 map extraordinary. But the more difficult question lies west of the name. Waldseemüller represented the newly recognized lands as separate from Asia. Between the western coast of South America and Asia lay water. In other words, his world contained an ocean corresponding to the Pacific. The date again is 1507. 6 years later, in 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama. From high ground, he saw an immense body of water on the other side. Europeans would call it the South Sea. 7 years after that, in 1520, the expedition, led by Ferdinand Magellan, found a navigable passage through the southern tip of South America and entered that ocean from the Atlantic. Those voyages gave Europeans direct geographical confirmation that a vast ocean separated the Americas from Asia. Waldseemüller's map appears before both of them, and unlike a hypothetical Terra Australis, the geographical logic is specific. There is a western side to the new continent. There is water beyond it. There is Asia farther west. How did he know? This is one of the moments where restraint makes the mystery stronger. There is no good evidence that Waldseemüller possessed a secret map produced by an advanced forgotten civilization. There is no need to insert an undocumented circumnavigation of South America, but historians also cannot point to one surviving chart, one clearly documented voyage, and say with complete confidence, this is where Waldseemüller obtained the information. The precise source remains uncertain. One possibility is that he did not know in the observational sense at all. He inferred. If the lands described by Vespucci constituted a separate continent rather than Asia, then logically they had to have another side. If Asia lay farther west, some body of water had to separate the two. The ocean could therefore be a geographical deduction. This sounds less dramatic than a secret voyage, but it is intellectually impressive. A map can sometimes predict geography by organizing incomplete evidence correctly. Scientists do something similar when they infer an unseen object from its effects, although Waldseemüller was working with far less systematic evidence and within a very different intellectual world. There is another possibility. Information may have reached European cartographers from voyages whose records have not survived clearly enough for us to reconstruct the chain. The early 16th century was not short of exploration. Portuguese and Spanish mariners were moving through waters that had barely entered European cartography. Charts were valuable and sometimes guarded. Information crossed borders through copying, commerce, diplomacy, espionage, and simple human movement. Not every voyage produced a famous, published narrative. Not every chart survived. The absence of a surviving source does not prove the existence of a secret voyage, but neither does it allow us to reconstruct every piece of information available to a cartographer in 1507. There is also the question of what Waldseemüller's western coastline actually represents. A line on a map can look much more authoritative to us than it was to its creator. We see a coast and instinctively imagine survey, but a cartographer can draw the far side of a continent because a continent needs an edge. The shape can be speculative. Its presence may express an idea rather than an observation. This is where the map becomes difficult to read with modern habits. We want a legend telling us which line is measured, which is reported, and which is conjectural. Waldseemüller's map gives us no convenient modern confidence scale. The woodcut does not become lighter where certainty weakens. The unknown can be printed with the same black ink as the known, and yet the map contains enough genuine new geographical knowledge that the speculative parts borrow credibility from the accurate ones. This is a recurring feature of the maps in our story. Truth and uncertainty share the same visual language. To understand how extraordinary the 1507 map was, it helps to remember how slowly geographical information could become materially useful. A sailor returning from the Western Atlantic might know something new. That did not mean every scholar in Europe immediately knew it. First there had to be a record, perhaps a chart, perhaps a letter, perhaps a printed account. Someone had to obtain it. Someone had to interpret it. Names had to be translated. Distances had to be reconciled with other reports. Then a cartographer had to decide which information deserved to displace the geography already on his map. New knowledge did not arrive in a clean update. It arrived as a dispute. And in 1507, the dispute over the western lands was still very young. Only 15 years had passed since Columbus's first Atlantic crossing. A child born in Europe in 1492 could still have been a teenager when Waldseemüller's map appeared. During that short span, the European conception of the inhabited world had begun to fracture. The Atlantic had once marked the western edge of familiar geography. Now ships kept returning from beyond it. The problem was no longer simply that new islands had been discovered. The dimensions of the entire world were becoming unstable. That instability had physical consequences for sailors. A mapmaker could debate whether the new lands belonged to Asia from a study in Europe. A navigator approaching an unfamiliar coast had a more immediate set of concerns. Where could the ship anchor? Was the apparent bay actually navigable? How far did the coastline continue? Could fresh water be found? How much food remained? And, increasingly, was there a passage through? This last question became one of the great geographical obsessions of the period. If the Americas stood between Europe and the riches of Asia, then sailors wanted a way around or through them. A strait could transform global commerce. Every opening in a coastline acquired significance. Every gulf might continue farther than expected. Every report of water beyond the land could matter. The map was not simply describing the world. People were looking at it for weaknesses. They wanted to know where the barrier opened. Balboa's journey in 1513 provided a critical piece of the puzzle. The expedition crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and Balboa reached a point from which he could see the ocean beyond. For Europeans, this established something profound. There really was another sea. The western lands were not simply an inconvenient coastal fringe of Asia. A major body of water lay between, but seeing an ocean from Panama and understanding its scale were very different achievements. Magellan's expedition would provide a much harsher lesson. In 1519, 5 ships departed Spain under Magellan's command. Their purpose included finding a western route to the spice-producing regions of Asia. They sailed across the Atlantic and down the coast of South America, searching for a passage. This meant repeated disappointment. An opening might look promising. It might turn out to be a river, or a bay, or a dead end. Each investigation cost time and supplies. The farther south they travelled, the colder and more difficult conditions became. Eventually, they wintered at San Julian in Patagonia. There was mutiny. There were punishments. A ship was wrecked. Another later deserted and returned towards Spain. This is what a coastline means when the map is unfinished. It means human beings physically testing openings one by one. A line that takes a second to trace with a finger can require months to understand from a ship. Finally, in October 1520, the expedition entered a complicated waterway near the southern end of the continent. For weeks, the remaining ships worked their way through channels surrounded by unfamiliar land. Then the passage opened. The water beyond was not another bay. They had reached the ocean Waldseemüller had already placed on paper 13 years earlier. Magellan named it the Pacific because of the relatively calm conditions encountered after leaving the strait. The name would prove almost comically inadequate as a general description of the world's largest ocean. What followed was not an easy crossing. The Pacific was far larger than the expedition expected. For months they sailed without obtaining adequate fresh provisions. Food deteriorated. Hunger became severe. Illness spread. Men died. The geographical distance that appears as a modest blue space on a world map became an enormous human ordeal when crossed at the speed of a 16th century sailing vessel. That difference between mapped distance and lived distance is easy to forget. On Waldseemüller's map, the Pacific is an idea. For Magellan's crew, it became weeks, then months, of water. No supermarket waited beyond the edge of the woodcut. No forecast explained when the wind would change. No accurate global chart told them how long the crossing would last. The map could suggest that an ocean existed. It could not tell them what surviving that ocean would cost. Magellan himself never completed the circumnavigation. He was killed in the Philippines in 1521. The expedition continued without him, and in September 1522, the Victoria, commanded on the final leg by Juan Sebastián Elcano, returned to Spain. Of the roughly 270 men associated with the expedition at departure, only a small fraction completed the entire circumnavigation aboard the Victoria. The achievement transformed geographical understanding, but it did so through exhaustion, hunger, violence, disease, and loss. The planet had become measurable in a new way. It had also become much larger. And by then, Waldseemüller had already changed his own map of the world. In 1516, he produced another major work, the Carta Marina. It is one of the most intriguing details in this entire story. The man whose 1507 map seems astonishingly modern in its separation of the Americas from Asia did not simply continue refining that same vision. The later map is different. The confident arrangement of the Western Hemisphere seen in 1507 is altered. The presentation of the new lands reflects a more cautious or changed interpretation, and the famous name America disappears. In other words, Waldseemüller himself did not behave like a man guarding certain secret knowledge of the Pacific. He behaved more like a scholar confronting unstable evidence. He revised, That is enormously important. If the 1507 map came from a precise secret survey of the western coast of South America, the retreat from that geography becomes difficult to explain. If it was partly an intellectual reconstruction based on incomplete information, the change makes much more sense. A mapmaker can be accidentally close to the truth and then move away from it. History does not always progress from ignorance to accuracy in a straight line. Sometimes a good idea appears before the evidence is strong enough to protect it. Then it disappears. Then later observations bring it back. The same thing can happen with names. Waldseemüller abandoned America. Other cartographers did not. The word escaped. This is the strange power of copying again. A creator can lose control over his own uncertainty. Someone else has already printed the idea. Another workshop copies it. A reader accepts it. A globe incorporates it. Eventually, the tentative label becomes ordinary language. 5 centuries later, most people using the word America have never heard of the small, scholarly circle at Saint-Dié that helped place it on a map. The name outlived the debate that created it. The map itself nearly did not. Waldseemüller's 1507 world map was produced in an edition believed to have numbered around 1,000 copies. Today, only one copy of that original edition is known to survive. That number deserves a moment. 1,000 became one. If that final copy had been destroyed by fire, damp, insects, war, careless storage, or simple disposal, one of the most important maps in the history of European cartography might now be known only indirectly, and we would not know exactly what we were missing. This is the problem of survival bias in its most tangible form. Historical archives do not contain everything that once existed. They contain what escaped destruction. That means a mysterious surviving map may once have belonged to an entire family of documents. We cannot assume uniqueness simply because only one specimen reached us, nor can we invent missing sources whenever an explanation becomes inconvenient. Both temptations are dangerous. The disciplined position sits somewhere between them. Lost maps certainly existed. Lost voyage records certainly existed. But a missing document can explain only what the surviving evidence reasonably allows. With Waldseemüller, that leaves us in an unusual place. The Pacific on the 1507 map does not prove a forgotten circumnavigation. It does not require a secret civilization. It may reflect inference from the idea that the new western lands constituted a separate continent. It may also incorporate geographical information whose precise route to Saint-Dié is no longer recoverable. We simply cannot reconstruct every source with certainty, and, for once, saying that does not weaken the story. It is the story. A man working far from the ocean printed a world that, in one important respect, resembled the world Europeans would confirm only later. Then he reconsidered parts of it. The map survived. Most copies did not. The name he introduced remained. The geographical confidence behind it did not. And while Europeans struggled to decide whether the lands across the Atlantic formed a new continent, another map had already been created on the opposite side of Eurasia. It was older than Waldseemüller's map by more than a century. It was made in Korea in 1402. Its makers had never sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. Portuguese navigators would not round the southern tip of Africa for another 86 years. Yet, when we look at the Kangnido, Africa is already there, not as a vague rumour at the edge of the page. As part of a connected world, stretching from Europe and Africa across Asia to Korea and Japan. The question this time is not whether someone secretly crossed an unknown ocean. It is something quieter and perhaps more remarkable. How far can knowledge travel when the person carrying it never travels the whole distance? In 1402, more than 80 years before Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa for Portugal, a map was created in Korea that already included the African continent as part of a connected old world. The map is known today as the Kangnido. Its full name is much longer, Honil Gangni Yokde Gukdo Jido, usually translated as something close to a map of integrated lands and regions of historical countries and capitals. The original 1402 version has not survived. What we have are later copies preserved in Japan. That alone places us back inside one of the recurring problems of this story. We are not looking at the first object. We are looking at descendants, and yet even through those descendants, the scale of the idea is remarkable. The Kangnido attempts to represent an enormous connected world. China dominates much of the map. Korea is highly prominent. Japan appears to the east. But the map does not stop there. Westward, the geographical world continues through Central and Western Asia. Then, at the far side, there is Europe, and below it, Africa. For a modern viewer, the immediate temptation is obvious. How could Korean scholars in 1402 know the shape of Africa before Europeans had sailed around it? The simplest answer is that they did not need to sail around it themselves. The knowledge had already travelled. That is the central lesson of the Kangnido. Geographical information can move across a continent through a chain of people, none of whom has personally travelled the full distance represented on the final map. A merchant does not need to walk from Morocco to Korea. A Persian astronomer does not need to visit Seoul. A Korean scholar does not need to sail past the Cape of Good Hope. Information can travel in stages. And in the centuries before the Kangnido was made, Eurasia had experienced a historical system unusually well suited to moving information over long distances. The Mongol empires. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century were violent on an enormous scale, but the political world that followed also connected regions that had previously belonged to more separate networks. Courts, postal systems, trade routes, diplomatic missions, scholars, merchants, religious travellers, and administrators moved across territories extending from East Asia deep into Western Eurasia. People sometimes call this period the Pax Mongolica, although the phrase can sound far more peaceful than the lived reality deserves. For a merchant travelling through parts of the Mongol world, political unification could make long-distance movement more predictable. For communities that had been conquered, the process that created that system could be catastrophic. Both things can be true at once. What matters for our map is that information moved. Chinese scholars gained access to geographical knowledge connected to the Islamic world. Islamic geographical traditions contained far more information about Africa and the Indian Ocean than a purely East Asian source would have generated independently. Those materials could then enter Chinese cartography. From China, geographical knowledge moved onward into Korea. The Kangnido was assembled from earlier sources rather than produced from direct exploration by a single group of Korean travellers. Its makers were compilers. And compilation, as we have already seen, can be one of the most powerful technologies in geography. A map maker does not need to discover a continent. He needs access to someone else's knowledge of it. Then he has to decide what to trust. This is where the Kangnido becomes more interesting than a simple Africa before Dias headline. Because the map is not modern, its proportions are highly unequal. China is enormous. Korea is much larger and more prominent than a modern equal-scale world map would make it. Europe is compressed toward the western edge. Africa is recognizable in a broad sense, but its geometry is far from the precise outline we now know. And this is exactly what we should expect. The Kangnido was not designed according to the same cartographic priorities as a modern classroom wall map. It was a world image shaped by political importance, inherited geography, available sources, and the world view of the people who made it. A modern map invites us to believe that every square centimetre of the planet should be treated according to a single mathematical scale. The Kangnido does not make that promise. It tells us what was geographically known, but also what mattered. Korea appears large because Korea mattered to Korean mapmakers. China dominates because China occupied an enormous intellectual and political place within the regional order. A distant European kingdom could be squeezed into a smaller visual space without preventing the map from serving its larger purpose. That purpose was not merely navigation. The Kangnido was not a sailor's chart designed to guide a vessel around the African coast. It was closer to an intellectual and political picture of the known world. That distinction matters. If we judge it as a modern nautical chart, it fails immediately. If we judge it as evidence of long-distance knowledge exchange, it becomes extraordinary. The African shape is therefore not proof that a Korean ship sailed around the Cape before the Portuguese. It is proof of something else. Someone, somewhere in the chain of sources, possessed enough geographical information for Africa to be represented as a major landmass with a southern end. That information moved eastward, and eventually it reached a Korean map. This is a much less dramatic sentence than Koreans discovered Africa. It is also far more historically interesting, because it forces us to abandon a very modern habit. We like to attach knowledge to nations. The Portuguese knew this. The Chinese knew that. The Koreans knew something else. Historical knowledge was rarely distributed so cleanly. A Persian merchant might know a harbour that a Chinese court official did not. A Muslim astronomer working under Mongol rule might possess geographical texts unknown to a sailor from the same empire. A Korean scholar could inherit a place name from a Chinese map whose source ultimately derived from Arabic geographical traditions. Knowledge moved through professions and networks, not just flags. And each time it moved, it could change. A name heard in Arabic might be written in Persian. That form could be translated or phonetically transformed into Chinese characters. Later, a Korean reader encountered the Chinese version. By the end of the process, the sound of the original place name might be difficult to recognize. Yet the geographical idea could survive. This is one of the strangest features of historical information. Meaning can travel farther than pronunciation. The same is true of shape. Suppose a source map contains a roughly correct southern end of Africa. A copyist reproduces it. Another mapmaker compresses the western half of the world to make space for East Asia. The continent becomes narrower. A coastline shifts. A river moves. But the underlying fact remains. Africa ends. There is water below it. That single inherited idea is enough to create the apparent impossibility. Portuguese sailors had not yet rounded the Cape, but somebody else's geographical tradition had already told East Asian mapmakers that Africa had a southern boundary. To understand how surprising that is, it helps to remember what happened when the Portuguese actually tried to move around Africa by sea. The process took generations. During the 15th century, Portuguese voyages gradually pushed farther down the western African coast. Each stage required practical knowledge. Currents mattered. Wind systems mattered. A coast that looked simple on a later map could be extremely difficult to work along from the deck of a sailing vessel. Returning north could be harder than sailing south. The development of Atlantic navigation, therefore, required not only courage, but accumulated technique. A sailor did not merely need to know where Africa was. He needed to know how to get home. By the time Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip in 1488, Portuguese exploration had been proceeding for decades. The voyage itself demonstrated how little a clean coastline on a map conveys. Dias's ships were driven by storms far from the coast. When the weather eased and the expedition turned east and then north, they eventually reached land again and realized that they had passed the southern end of Africa. The Cape was not conquered through a neat, deliberate turn around a visible corner. It was partly revealed by displacement, weather, and deduction. The ocean moved the ships beyond the point the sailors were trying to understand. Only afterward could the geography be reconstructed. That is an important contrast with the Kangnido. In 1402, the southern end of Africa already existed as an idea on a map in Korea. In 1488, Portuguese sailors physically experienced what that southern end meant. Wind, cold water, long distance, uncertainty, a ship under strain. These are two different kinds of geographical knowledge. One is inherited representation. The other is bodily experience. Maps often confuse them because both become lines. A coastline heard about from distant sources and a coastline personally surveyed can look equally solid once drawn in ink. The material surface hides the difference. The Kangnido also reveals how geographical scale can be psychological. Look at the world from the perspective of its makers, and the arrangement becomes more understandable. Europe is distant. Africa is distant. The Islamic world is distant. China is near and culturally central. Korea is home. This is not so different from the way people still imagine geography emotionally. A place where one's family lives can feel larger than a country one has never visited. A road used every day occupies more mental space than a distant region many times its physical size. Maps can formalize that bias. Modern cartography attempts to suppress it mathematically. Older world maps often display it openly. The Kangnido is therefore simultaneously geographical and political. It says where places are, approximately. It also says which places deserve space. And yet, even within that unequal visual world, distant regions were not erased. That is what makes the map so important. Someone in early 15th century Korea could stand before a representation of a world extending all the way to Africa and Europe. Most people who saw it would never visit those places. They might never meet anyone who had. The physical distance was almost unimaginable, but the map reduced the distance. An inscription associated with the Kangnido tradition expresses the usefulness of compressing the vast world into a form that can be examined without personally travelling through it. This is such an ordinary idea to us that it is easy to miss how profound it is. A map allows you to see from nowhere. No human being can stand high enough to look down upon all of Africa, Asia, and Europe at once. Yet a map creates that impossible viewpoint. It compresses months and years of travel into the movement of an eye. A caravan route that might require weeks becomes a few centimetres. An ocean that can kill a crew becomes a patch of painted space. A mountain range becomes a symbol. The map is physically small. The world remains enormous. This contrast would have been especially striking in an age when travel was slow. Today, someone can fly from Seoul to Europe within a day. For most of history, distance was a different category of experience. Travel meant exposure, bad weather, animals, food, accommodation, political borders, banditry, disease, river crossings, mountain passes, waiting. The possibility that a route described as safe last year was not safe this year. Information that travelled from Western Eurasia to Korea had survived all of these kinds of barriers, even if the physical document itself changed hands only in stages. This is why the real achievement behind the Kangnido is not a hidden voyage. It is transmission. A forgotten merchant matters. A translator matters. A court scholar matters. A copyist matters. Someone correcting a place name matters. Someone preserving an old map long enough for another person to copy it matters. Civilizations become connected through thousands of small acts that rarely receive names in chronicles. And then, centuries later, we look at the final object and ask how the mapmaker knew. The answer may involve hundreds of people. This also explains why information could survive while context disappeared. Suppose a Chinese mapmaker copies a western coastline from an Islamic source, but does not preserve a detailed note explaining where the source came from. A Korean cartographer later copies the Chinese map. The shape survives. The citation does not. Several generations later, the information looks mysterious. We have the answer, but not the route that carried the answer to us. This pattern will become extremely important when we reach Piri Reis. Piri Reis actually tells us that he used older maps. That is unusually helpful. Most surviving maps are less generous. They simply present their geography. The source chain remains invisible. The Kangnido also teaches us that Europe was not the only centre from which the world was being assembled. This sounds obvious, but traditional narratives of cartographic history often move through Greek geography, medieval Europe, Portuguese exploration, Columbus, Mercator, and modern mapping. That sequence is important. It is not the whole story. Chinese cartography had its own long traditions. Islamic geographers preserved, transformed, and expanded geographical knowledge. Indian Ocean sailors operated within maritime networks long before Portuguese fleets entered them. East Asian states inherited and reworked geographical material circulating across Eurasia. There was no single map-making civilization waiting for the rest of humanity to catch up. There were overlapping systems. Sometimes they met. When they did, the result could be startling. The Kangnido is one of those meetings preserved on a surface, and its survival is itself precarious. The original Korean map from 1402 is gone. If later copies had not survived in Japan, we would know far less about what its makers had assembled. The information would not become false. It would simply become invisible to us. This is a recurring danger when talking about what people knew. We can only measure past knowledge through surviving evidence. Evidence is not evenly preserved. Paper burns. Silk decays. Libraries disappear. War scatters collections. Political change can make old documents irrelevant or dangerous. A map that once seemed valuable can become wrapping material. Another can be copied precisely because someone admires it. Survival is partly accident. So, when we say that the Kangnido is one of the earliest surviving maps to show a connected Afro-Eurasian world in this way, the word surviving matters. There may have been earlier maps that did not reach us. That possibility is reasonable. It does not give us permission to invent their contents, but it should make us cautious about treating the earliest surviving object as the first time an idea ever existed. The same caution applies to exploration. Dias rounded the Cape in 1488 within the documented Portuguese maritime tradition. That does not mean no human being had ever moved through waters around southern Africa before him. Local African populations obviously knew their own coasts. Indian Ocean and African maritime networks were far older than Portuguese arrival. What changed was the integration of the route into a specific European imperial and cartographic system. The word discovery compresses these distinctions until they disappear. Maps can help restore them if we read carefully. The Kangnido does not show us that Koreans discovered Africa. It shows us that Africa existed inside a Korean geographical imagination because knowledge had crossed cultural and political boundaries. That is stranger in a quieter way. No heroic expedition is required. No single person needs to know everything. The network performs the miracle. And once we recognize that, one of the largest assumptions behind impossible maps begins to collapse. A map maker does not have to be the origin of the map's knowledge. He may only be its temporary custodian. That idea leads directly to the most famous map in this entire story. A map produced by an Ottoman admiral in 1513. A map containing Atlantic coastlines assembled from earlier sources. A map whose maker explicitly said he had used charts created by other people. A map that later became attached to claims about Columbus, lost ancient geography, and an ice-free, Antarctica. The surviving fragment is real. The annotations are real. The source problem is real, but the version of the story that made the Piri Reis Map famous requires us to decide whether one distorted southern coastline is evidence of something far greater. And this time, we already know what to ask. Not simply, how could he know, but whose knowledge are we actually looking at? Of all the maps in this story, none has attracted more mythology than the map drawn by the Ottoman admiral Piri Reis in 1513. The surviving fragment is immediately compelling. It shows parts of the Atlantic world with coastlines, islands, notes, ships, animals, and decorative details spread across parchment. Western Europe and Africa appear on one side. Across the Atlantic are parts of the Caribbean and the eastern coast of South America, and then the southern coastline bends. That bend became famous. Much later, some writers argued that this portion of the map represented Antarctica without its modern ice cover. If that were true, the implications would be enormous. It would suggest that someone had mapped the Antarctic landmass long before its accepted discovery, and not merely after observing a wall of ice from offshore, but somehow with knowledge of coastlines hidden beneath or altered by ice. It is the kind of claim that naturally invites lost civilizations, forgotten surveying traditions, and stories of knowledge surviving from a remote prehistoric age. The problem is that the map itself does not require any of those explanations, and Piri Reis tells us something unusually useful about how he made it. He used other maps. This matters more than almost anything else. The surviving annotations indicate that Piri compiled his chart from multiple earlier sources. These appear to have included maps associated with older geographical traditions, as well as more recent Portuguese and Spanish discoveries. He was not claiming to have personally surveyed all the coastlines he drew. He was assembling them. In other words, the Piri Reis Map is exactly the kind of object we have been preparing for since the beginning of this journey. A map made by one person containing the accumulated knowledge, errors, distortions, and inherited assumptions of many others. That does not make it less remarkable. It makes the real historical problem richer. Piri Reis was an Ottoman naval commander and experienced mariner. He lived in a Mediterranean world where geographical intelligence could move through trade, warfare, piracy, capture, diplomacy, and copying. Charts were valuable. Pilots were valuable. A ship carried more than cargo. It carried knowledge. If a vessel was captured, its maps could be captured with it. If a navigator entered the service of another power, his experience travelled with him. If one chart was copied before being lost, the copy could preserve information long after the original disappeared. So, when Piri says he used multiple maps, we should take that seriously as an explanation, not treat it as an inconvenient detail standing in the way of a mystery. The mystery is the network. One of the most intriguing traditions associated with his map concerns Christopher Columbus. Piri's annotations have long been interpreted as indicating that one of his sources was connected to a map used or produced by Columbus. No such original Columbus chart survives for us to compare directly. That absence has helped make the Piri Reis Map especially attractive. It appears to preserve a faint echo of a lost map from the first generation of European Atlantic exploration. That is entirely plausible. Documents disappear. Charts used aboard ships were especially vulnerable. They were handled, folded, exposed to moisture, copied, damaged, discarded, and sometimes lost with the vessels carrying them. The sea is an efficient destroyer of archives. If Piri had access to a chart descended from Columbus's voyages, that would not be miraculous. It would be exactly the kind of transmission maritime competition could produce. The Iberian powers had strong incentives to control geographical information, but no information system was perfectly sealed. The Ottoman Mediterranean intersected with Venetian, Genoese, Spanish, Portuguese, North African, and other maritime networks. Knowledge crossed those boundaries even when governments preferred that it did not. The map, therefore, gives us a glimpse of a world where geography behaved almost like intelligence gathered in wartime. A new harbour could be strategic. A new island could matter commercially. A safer route could save ships. A chart showing the direction of a coastline could be worth far more than the parchment on which it was drawn. Piri Reis lived inside that world, and because of this, the presence of newly mapped Atlantic lands on his chart is not difficult to explain. By 1513, Portuguese voyages had been moving along the coast of South America for years. Spanish exploration had expanded across the Caribbean. Information existed. Piri could obtain some of it. The more difficult question is, what happened in the south? The surviving coastline of South America descends and then turns sharply eastward. To modernize, if the map is rotated and compared selectively, that eastern extension can look tempting. Supporters of the Antarctica interpretation argued that this was not simply a distorted continuation of South America. It was the northern coast of Antarctica. The claim became especially famous through Charles Hapgood in the 20th century. Hapgood believed that certain early maps preserved geographical information inherited from a much older civilization, one capable of mapping the world before known historical societies possessed such techniques. The Piri Reis Map became a centerpiece of that argument. Later, popular writers expanded the idea even further. The map was no longer merely an Ottoman compilation. It became evidence of a forgotten ancient survey of the planet. But the actual cartographic problems point in a more ordinary direction. The southern coast on the Piri Reis Map can be understood as a distorted representation connected to South America, combined with uncertainties about how far the continent extended and how southern land should be arranged. Early 16th century mapmakers were still working out the basic shape of the Western Hemisphere. They did not know exactly where South America ended. The Strait of Magellan would not be entered by Europeans until 1520. Piri was drawing 7 years earlier. That is critical. If the southern coast of South America had not yet been traced to its end within the information available to him, then some distortion or imaginative continuation is hardly surprising. There was also the persistent expectation of southern land. As we saw with Oronce Fine, cartographers did not need direct observation in order to draw large southern regions. A coastline could be influenced by theoretical geography. And once several maps with different projections and scales were combined, distortions became almost inevitable. This is another point modern viewers can underestimate. Today, if you want to merge two maps, software can transform coordinate systems mathematically. Piri Reis had no such system. Suppose one source chart represents the Western African coast at one scale. Another gives parts of Brazil at another. A third shows Caribbean islands with different distortions. A fourth follows an older geographical convention. These pieces do not simply fit together like a puzzle. Some must be stretched mentally. Some must be compressed. Some must be placed according to estimates. When enough incompatible material is combined, a coastline can bend in strange ways. The result may look intentional. The cause may be structural. There is also a basic problem with the idea of an accurately mapped ice-free Antarctica. Antarctica without its ice is not simply Antarctica as we see it today, with the white layer removed. The ice sheets are immense, and their weight depresses portions of the crust. Sea level would also change dramatically in a world without those ice sheets. The relationship between exposed land and ocean would therefore not produce a simple modern coastline waiting invisibly beneath the ice. Claims that an early map perfectly reproduces an ancient ice-free Antarctic shore usually rely on highly selective comparisons. The maps are rotated, scaled, stretched. Sections that seem to match are emphasized. Sections that do not match receive less attention. This is a dangerous way to test resemblance. Two irregular shapes can be made to look surprisingly similar if enough freedom is allowed. A coastline contains thousands of curves. Human pattern recognition does the rest. The strongest interpretation remains much less exotic. The southern feature is part of the South American geography available to Piri Reis, distorted by the methods and uncertainties of early 16th century cartography. That may sound disappointing only if we expect the map to provide evidence of a vanished super-civilization. Once we stop asking it to do that, the document becomes extraordinary again. Because Piri Reis was operating close to the frontier of global information, consider the date. Columbus's first voyage had taken place only 21 years earlier. The Portuguese had reached India by sea only 15 years earlier. Brazil had entered Portuguese records only 13 years earlier. Europeans had not yet crossed the Isthmus of Panama to see the Pacific. Magellan's circumnavigation had not begun. The basic geographical structure of the modern world was still unsettled. And an Ottoman naval officer had already assembled a map incorporating information from both sides of the Atlantic. That is not mundane. It is evidence of how rapidly useful knowledge could spread. The Atlantic powers did not possess a monopoly on their discoveries for long. A coastline encountered by a Portuguese expedition could move into a Portuguese chart. That chart, or part of its information, could move through Mediterranean networks. A copy might be acquired. An enemy ship might be captured. A pilot might describe what he knew. Years later, an Ottoman cartographer could place the information onto a new surface. The chain might leave almost no written explanation behind. This is what makes old maps so dangerous to interpret backwards. We see the final object. We do not see the dozens of people who may stand behind each line. There is another human detail hidden by the neatness of the parchment. Information collected at sea was expensive. Not simply financially expensive, physically expensive. Every coastline on a chart could represent days or weeks of exposure. Ships leaked, sails tore, crew members became ill, food spoiled, water became unpleasant, storms scattered vessels. A navigator making observations did so while everyone aboard remained dependent on the ship staying afloat. The abstract line came later. The discomfort came first. This is worth remembering when looking at a place like the Brazilian coast on the Piri Reis Map. Today, it is ink. Before that, it was distance. Before distance became measurement, it was time. And time at sea consumed provisions. A map can compress all of this until the human effort disappears. Piri Reis saw the result. He did not have to repeat every voyage. This is the efficiency of inherited knowledge. One generation suffers through the uncertainty. The next generation copies the line, but copying creates its own dangers. Every copied map contains choices. What does the copyist preserve? What does he omit? Does he understand every label? Does he recognize when two sources use different names for the same place? Does he know that one chart is more reliable than another? Does he accidentally give equal visual authority to an observed coastline and a speculative one? That last problem is especially important. On the finished map, both lines look like ink. There is no modern data layer explaining confidence. Piri Reis sometimes included notes, which help us more than many maps do, but they still do not reconstruct every step. That missing context is exactly where later legends can grow. A strange line becomes an unexplained line. An unexplained line becomes a mysterious coastline. A mysterious coastline becomes Antarctica. Then Antarctica becomes evidence of a civilization we have never found. Each step moves farther away from the actual object. The map itself is quieter. It says, in effect, that Piri gathered geographical material from several sources and attempted to combine it. That should be our starting point. There is another reason his map became so famous. It was rediscovered in the 20th century in the Topkapı Palace in Istanbul. For centuries it had not been part of the popular European history of cartography. Then, suddenly, a surviving fragment from 1513 appeared in modern scholarly discussion. Artifacts discovered or rediscovered in archives have a particular emotional effect. They feel as though they have been waiting. Of course, the parchment had not been hiding with a secret. It had simply survived, where later researchers eventually recognized its significance. Still, that rediscovery matters because it reminds us how incomplete historical knowledge remains even in relatively well-documented periods. Objects can sit in collections uncatalogued or misunderstood. Texts can be misidentified. Fragments can become significant only after someone notices a connection. The past does not reveal itself all at once. It is constantly being reorganized by what survives and what we learn to recognize. Piri Reis himself would continue working with geography. His later Kitab Bahriye, or Book of Navigation, contains extensive information about Mediterranean coasts, ports, islands, and sailing conditions. This helps place the 1513 world map in the context of a practical maritime mind. He was not merely decorating parchment with speculative continents. He cared about navigation. He understood that coastal knowledge had real value. A harbour drawn incorrectly could have consequences. A shoal omitted from a coastal guide could matter. This makes the exaggerations surrounding his world map even more ironic. The actual historical Piri Reis is interesting enough. An Ottoman mariner gathering information from a rapidly changing world, combining old geographical traditions with discoveries made by rival powers, and preserving traces of source maps now lost. He does not need Antarctica. In fact, Antarctica can distract from the more important lesson. The Piri Reis Map demonstrates how fast geographical knowledge could escape its point of origin. It also demonstrates how fragile our reconstruction of that process is. We know some of his sources because he tells us. We do not possess all of them, so some lines on his map inevitably have incomplete genealogies. But an incomplete genealogy is not evidence of impossible technology. It is evidence of missing documents, and missing documents are everywhere in history. This brings us back to one of the strongest ideas running through all 10 maps. A surviving map can preserve information older than itself. That sounds obvious when stated plainly, but it has enormous consequences. If Piri Reis, in 1513, copied a Portuguese chart from 1505, then the coastline on his map represents knowledge at least 8 years older than the surviving object. If that Portuguese chart copied an earlier survey, the information is older still. If a medieval map copied classical material, a line can travel across centuries. The date of the surviving map is not necessarily the date of the knowledge it contains. This is one reason genuine old maps can appear to know too much. They are not always speaking only for their own moment. They are archives of previous moments. And once we understand that, the phrase impossible map begins to change meaning. Some maps look impossible because their creators inherited information from sources we no longer possess. Some look impossible because speculative geography happened to resemble later discoveries. Some because a distorted coastline is being compared to the wrong continent. Some because modern viewers expect consistency where early maps were built from unequal evidence. And occasionally, a map really does preserve something remarkably early, but no explanation works for all of them. That becomes even clearer when we leave the oceanic world entirely. The next maps in our story were not created by sailors attempting to understand the Atlantic. One was pressed into clay in ancient Mesopotamia. Another was drawn on papyrus in Egypt, more than 1,000 years before the Common Era. They do not show Antarctica. They do not predict America. They are older and, in some ways, stranger, because they ask a more basic question. At what point did humans begin taking the world beneath their feet and turning it into something that could be seen from above? Long before anyone argued about the Pacific, Australia, or Antarctica, people were already trying to do something that is easy to underestimate. They were turning lived space into an object. A river walked beside. A road followed for days. A quarry hidden beyond dry hills. A city known by walls, markets, temples, and neighborhoods. All of it could somehow be reduced into marks on clay or papyrus. That act alone is extraordinary. One of the oldest surviving examples comes from Mesopotamia. The object is small. There is no vast Renaissance sheet, no decorative ocean full of ships, no continent stretched across a wall. Instead, there is a clay tablet. On it, a schematic world. Babylon appears as one of the central features. The Euphrates runs through the image. Other regions and places are marked around it. Encircling the known lands is a body of water sometimes translated as the Bitter River. Beyond that boundary are more distant, stranger regions. The surviving object is commonly known as the Babylonian Map of the world. It is not a modern map in any ordinary sense. Its proportions are not useful for navigation. Its world is not laid out according to a consistent mathematical scale. It combines geography with a broader conception of how the inhabited world was organized. And that is precisely why it matters. The tablet shows that mapping was not only about finding the shortest road, it could also be about making the world mentally manageable. Babylonian scholars lived in a landscape shaped by rivers, irrigation, cities, agriculture, and political power. Movement through that environment was practical and immediate. Fields depended on water. Canals mattered. Distances between settlements mattered. But the tablet goes beyond local management. It reduces a much larger world into a single visible arrangement. To do this, someone had to abandon the perspective of everyday life. No one experiences a region from directly above while walking through it. No one stands in Babylon and simultaneously sees the Euphrates, distant countries, and the outer boundary of the world. The map creates an impossible viewpoint. It asks the mind to rise above the landscape. That may be one of the most important inventions in the history of thought. The world can be somewhere else. A place can be represented without being present. Distance can be compressed. Memory can be externalized. And once geography exists outside the human mind, it can be stored, copied, taught, corrected, or misunderstood. The material chosen for this particular map also tells us something about survival. Clay is humble. It is also stubborn. Papyrus disappears easily outside very favourable conditions. Leather decays. Wood burns. Clay tablets, when preserved under the right circumstances, can survive for extraordinary spans of time. A civilization could write administrative accounts, prayers, astronomical observations, contracts, and geographical ideas into wet clay, and leave behind a record more durable than many later libraries. The map is therefore a survivor, partly because of what it is made from. This is one of history's quieter distortions. What survives is not always what was most important. Sometimes it is simply what was difficult to destroy. The Babylonian map also reminds us that cartography and worldview were once less separated than we are accustomed to. A modern road map does not usually explain the moral or cosmic meaning of a city. A Babylonian world representation could belong to a different intellectual environment. The known world was not merely a collection of coordinates. It existed inside ideas about order. The presence of Babylon near the heart of the representation should not surprise us. Human beings repeatedly place themselves near the centre of their own worlds. Medieval European maps did it in their own ways. Chinese cartographic traditions did it. The Kangnido enlarged regions that mattered most to its makers. Even modern maps are not completely innocent. The projection we choose changes how large countries look. The center of a world map is a decision. The place where the map is cut is a decision. There is no natural rule requiring the Atlantic to sit in the middle of a classroom wall. We simply become used to one arrangement and stop noticing the choice. The Babylonian tablet makes the choice visible. Babylon matters. The surrounding world is arranged in relation to it. And beyond the familiar regions, the map moves towards something more uncertain. Distant lands become difficult to separate from cosmological imagination. This is another feature modern viewers often dislike. We want a map either to be geographical or mythical. Ancient intellectual systems did not necessarily obey that division. A distant region could be physically real and symbolically charged. An edge could mark geography and also the limit of ordinary human knowledge. A river could be practical and cosmological. We are the ones insisting that those categories must always be separated. The tablet, therefore, asks a different question from the maps of the 16th century. Not, did someone reach an unknown continent? But, what did people believe a map was supposed to represent? That question becomes even more practical when we move from Mesopotamia to Egypt. More than 1,000 years before the Common Era, an Egyptian scribe created a map that is astonishing for a very different reason. It did not attempt to show the whole world. It showed terrain, specific terrain, and it appears to distinguish not only routes and landscape features, but different types of rock. The object is known as the Turin Papyrus Map. It is associated with the Wadi Hammamat region of Egypt's eastern desert and is generally dated to the reign of Ramesses IV in the 12th century BCE. The papyrus has been connected to a scribe named Amennacht, son of Ipui, from the workmen's community of Deir el-Medina. Here, unlike the anonymous abstraction of many ancient artifacts, we come close to a real individual. A trained scribe, someone whose work existed inside a society that needed records, labour organisation, and practical information. The map appears to be linked with quarrying and mining activity. That immediately changes the character of the document. This was not a philosophical exercise about the shape of the world. People needed to go somewhere. They needed to find resources. They needed to move workers through a difficult environment. The map shows wadis, routes, hills, and areas associated with quarrying. Different colours appear to distinguish different geological zones. That feature has led the Turin Papyrus to be described as the oldest surviving geological map known. Again, we should be careful with the modern word. Its maker was not practicing geology as a 19th or 20th century scientist would understand it. He did not belong to a modern academic discipline, but he was doing something recognizably geological. He was distinguishing the landscape according to the material properties of the ground. That mattered because rock was useful. The map was practical, and practicality can produce sophisticated knowledge long before anyone gives that knowledge a modern scientific name. The Egyptian state required stone. Monuments required stone. Statues required stone. Buildings required stone. Getting that material out of the eastern desert required organization. The desert is unforgiving in ways a museum display cannot communicate. On papyrus, the route is easy to trace. In reality, moving through the wadi meant heat, distance, limited water, loaded animals, tools, supplies, and people whose bodies had to endure the journey. A map can make a difficult route look almost gentle. The line does not sweat. The people following it did. This is another reason ancient maps are so deceptive when viewed in modern collections. The object is quiet. The activity behind it was not. A quarrying expedition required labour, food, water, transport, supervision, knowledge of routes, knowledge of where stone could actually be obtained, and, just as importantly, knowledge of where not to waste time. If a group travelled into the wrong wadi, the mistake was not a minor inconvenience. In an arid environment, wasted distance consumed water. A poor route could become dangerous. So a practical map could matter because human margins were narrow. The Turin Papyrus also violates another expectation many modern viewers carry unconsciously. South is placed toward the top. That can feel wrong, but north at the top is not a law of nature. It is a convention, a useful one, a deeply familiar one, but still a convention. The Egyptian mapmaker organized the space in a way that made sense for his own purpose and orientation. This is a good moment to notice how often we confuse familiarity with correctness. A map with south at the top is not upside down to the person who designed it that way. It is only upside down to us. The same is true of scale. Parts of the Wadi Hammamat landscape appear to have been straightened or adjusted to fit the available papyrus. Again, a modern viewer might call that inaccurate. But a map can become more useful by becoming less geometrically literal. Consider a subway map. The tunnels beneath a city do not actually run in neat horizontal, vertical, and 45-degree lines. They are simplified so that a passenger can understand connections. Practical clarity defeats exact geometry. The Turin Papyrus appears to operate with a similar intelligence. The landscape is being translated. Translation changes form. What matters is preserving the relationships needed by the user. This is a crucial point because it returns us to the earlier impossible maps. A distorted coastline is not automatically evidence of ignorance. Sometimes distortion is intentional. Sometimes it is forced by the medium. Sometimes it comes from combining sources. Sometimes it comes from misunderstanding. To interpret a map, we have to know what problem the mapmaker was trying to solve. The Turin Papyrus solved a local problem. The Babylonian Map of the world solved a conceptual one. The Kangnido solved a much larger representational one. Piri Reis tried to compile a rapidly changing Atlantic world. Waldseemüller attempted to reorganize the planet around discoveries that had destabilized inherited geography. All of them used the same basic human trick: make the large small. This may be the deepest continuity in the entire story. A map allows a person to possess space without physically occupying it. A king can see territory he has never visited. A sailor can study a coast before arriving. A quarry expedition can plan a route through desert. A scholar can contemplate Africa while living in Korea. A Mesopotamian scribe can place Babylon inside a world. There is power in that compression. Political power, economic power, military power, psychological power. To map something is not necessarily to own it, but maps have often helped people make ownership imaginable. This becomes especially important as we approach the final map in our list. Because the Saint-Bélec Slab may not simply represent where things were, it may represent who controlled them. The slab comes from Bronze Age Brittany. It is carved into stone. Its markings appear to correspond with surprising strength to a real landscape, not the entire world, not a continent, a territory. And if the interpretation is correct, then one of Europe's oldest known cartographic representations may also be a political object. That brings us closer to a world where rivers are boundaries, ridges are memory, and authority may be carved into stone rather than written into a legal document. The strange thing is that this map did not survive because people carefully preserved it. It survived after being broken and then used inside a grave. In 1900, the French archaeologist Paul du Châtelier was excavating a prehistoric burial mound in Brittany when he encountered an unusually large carved stone. It was not standing upright as a monument. It was not displayed where people could gather around it. It had been incorporated into a grave. The stone formed part of the wall of a Bronze Age burial structure at Saint-Bélec in the Finistère region of western France. One face was covered with an intricate arrangement of carved lines, depressions, circles, and geometric forms. Du Châtelier recognized that the slab was unusual. He removed it and took it to his chateau, where it entered his private archaeological collection. And then something rather appropriate happened to an object that may preserve an ancient landscape. It disappeared from scholarly attention. Not completely. Its existence was recorded, and it was eventually transferred with the collection to the Musée d'Archéologie Nationale. But for much of the 20th century, the Saint-Bélec Slab attracted little attention. It was stored away. Decades passed. The carved surface remained where researchers were not seriously asking what it represented. Then, more than a century after its discovery, archaeologists returned to it with a different question. What if the carvings were not merely decorative? What if they described a real place? The possibility transformed the slab. Researchers began comparing the carved network with the landscape surrounding the prehistoric site in Brittany. They examined the arrangement of lines and depressions, the overall shape of the carved field, and the topography of the Odette River region. The correspondence was striking enough for the researchers to propose that the slab represents part of a real territory. If that interpretation is correct, Saint-Bélec is among the oldest known cartographic representations of a territory in Europe. Its context belongs to the early Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 years ago. That makes the object older than the classical civilizations we normally associate with formal European geography. There is no latitude, no longitude, no compass rose, no written place names, no scale bar, and yet the stone may contain something fundamentally recognizable, a landscape reduced to symbols. The central network of carved lines has been interpreted in relation to the river system. Other markings may correspond to settlements, routes, enclosures, or significant landscape features, although not every symbol can be confidently identified. This uncertainty matters. It would be easy to look at the slab, accept that it is a map, and then begin assigning meaning to every mark. That would go beyond the evidence. We do not possess the legend. No Bronze Age cartographer left instructions explaining that one symbol means a village and another means a field. The map, if that is what it is, survives without its users. We have the object. We do not have the shared knowledge that once made the object easy to read. That may be the most haunting thing about it. A map is useful only when someone understands its language. Think about a modern map, stripped of every label, and handed to someone with no knowledge of our symbols. A blue line might be a river, or a road, a boundary, a route, a decorative mark. The meaning seems obvious to us because we have learned the code. The Saint-Bélec code is largely gone. We are trying to reconstruct it from the landscape itself. Researchers have used modern topographical analysis to compare the slab with the surrounding region, and the proposed match places the represented area within a section of Western Brittany. The scale is local rather than continental. That is important. This is not another world map. It is not trying to answer what lies beyond the ocean. It may be answering something more immediate. What belongs together here? Where does this territory begin and end? Where are its important places? And possibly, who controls them? The political interpretation is one of the most intriguing aspects of the Saint-Bélec Slab. Researchers have suggested that the mapped territory could relate to the domain of a Bronze Age political authority. If so, the slab may have been more than a practical geographical aid. It may have represented power. That possibility changes the emotional character of the map. A river is no longer merely a river. It can become an edge. A ridge can become a boundary. A settlement can become a center of control. A route can connect resources to authority. In a world without printed deeds, cadastral databases, or national borders drawn in standardized colors, territorial knowledge still mattered. People knew where they could graze animals. They knew which routes connected communities. They knew where water flowed. They knew where valuable resources could be obtained. They knew which neighbouring groups occupied land beyond familiar boundaries. Much of that knowledge did not need to be written. It could exist in memory. This is easy to underestimate because modern life allows us to outsource geographical memory. A phone can tell us where to turn. A property database can tell us where a parcel ends. A road sign can tell us the name of a town. A digital map can locate us within a few meters. Remove all of that, and landscape must be learned differently. People remember landmarks. A distinctive stone, a bend in a river, a ridgeline, a burial mound, a patch of woodland, a crossing. The geography lives partly in the body. You know a route because you have walked it. You know a slope because you have climbed it. You know the river because you have watched it change through seasons. You know the boundary because someone older showed it to you. A carved representation changes that relationship. Knowledge that had existed through movement and memory becomes external. It can be pointed at, perhaps discussed, perhaps displayed, perhaps used to communicate authority. The map becomes an object that can outlive the person who remembers the landscape. That is the same intellectual transformation we saw in Babylonian clay and Egyptian papyrus, but Saint-Bélec may bring another element into view. Possession. Maps have a long relationship with power because they make territory visible as a whole. A person walking through a valley experiences it piece by piece. A ruler looking at a map can experience the valley as one thing. That difference matters. Fields, waterways, settlements, and boundaries can be imagined as belonging to a single political unit. If the Saint-Bélec Slab served such a purpose, its maker was doing more than recording geography. The stone was turning landscape into territory, and territory is landscape with a claim attached. We cannot know exactly how the slab was displayed or used. It may have had functions that no modern interpretation has recovered, but its later treatment gives us another clue that something changed. The slab was broken, then one large piece was reused in the burial structure where Du Chatelier found it. This is not the normal fate we might imagine for an object representing valuable territorial knowledge. If it had once been important, why destroy it? One possibility proposed by researchers is that the destruction of the slab was connected with political change. If the map represented the territory controlled by a particular authority, breaking the map could have accompanied the end of that authority. This remains an interpretation. We cannot recover the motive from the stone itself. Perhaps the slab had simply lost its original importance. Perhaps it was convenient building material. Perhaps its destruction carried symbolic meaning. We do not know. But the possibility is worth lingering over because maps and political systems often share a lifespan. A boundary matters because people agree or are forced to recognize it. A kingdom collapses and the line changes. A ruler dies and territory fragments. A road loses importance. A settlement is abandoned. The landscape remains. Its political map does not. If Saint-Bélec recorded a Bronze Age domain, then the map may have become obsolete while the rivers it represented continued flowing. Eventually, the object itself was broken and absorbed into a grave. There is a peculiar reversal in that. The map may once have represented a living political landscape. Then it became architecture for the dead. Centuries passed. The political names disappeared. Whatever authority the slab may have represented disappeared. The language disappeared. The people who could read its symbols disappeared. Even the purpose of the carvings disappeared. The stone survived. This is the opposite of the Zeno Map. Friesland survived on paper, while the island itself had never existed. At Saint-Bélec, the landscape remained while the meaning of the map was lost. That contrast reaches the heart of why old maps can be so deceptive. A map and the world it represents have separate lives. One can survive without the other. A coastline can remain on paper after people stop believing in it. A real territory can remain on Earth after its map becomes unreadable. Sometimes the map outlives the knowledge. Sometimes the knowledge outlives the map. And sometimes both disappear, leaving only a later copy. The Saint-Bélec Slab also forces us to reconsider what we mean by accuracy. If the proposed topographical correspondence is correct, its makers were not attempting to reproduce the landscape with modern geometric precision. They were selecting. Certain features mattered enough to carve. Others did not. This is what every map does. Even the most accurate digital map is a selection. It does not show every blade of grass. It chooses information according to purpose. A road map emphasizes roads. A geological map emphasizes rock. A political map emphasizes boundaries. A nautical chart emphasizes water depth and hazards. The Saint-Bélec Slab may have emphasized whatever mattered to the community or authority that commissioned it. That purpose is partly lost. So some of its apparent mystery comes from our inability to ask the original user what they were trying to see. This is a useful correction to the question that began our journey. We started with maps that seemed to know too much. Saint-Bélec presents the opposite problem. We know too little. We have become the confused reader. 4,000 years ago, the carved lines may have been obvious to someone standing before them. A river everyone knew. A place everyone recognized. A boundary everyone understood. Today, researchers need scanning technology, topographical data, archaeological survey, and statistical comparison to recover part of what may once have required only a pointing finger. There is something quietly humbling in that. Technological sophistication does not guarantee contextual understanding. We can measure the grooves far more precisely than their makers ever could. We still cannot ask them what every groove meant. And this brings the countdown to its oldest and perhaps most intimate form of mystery. Not a continent drawn before discovery, not an ocean appearing too early, not a phantom island copied for generations. A piece of local land, familiar to people whose names are gone, translated into stone. The 10 maps we have followed do not point toward one secret explanation. They point in almost the opposite direction. One was likely entangled with fabrication. One was a modern forgery attached to a genuine Norse achievement. Some mixed inherited geographical traditions with speculation. One placed the Pacific where direct European confirmation had not yet reached. Another carried African geographical knowledge across Eurasia to Korea. Piri Reis compiled Atlantic information from sources whose complete chain we no longer possess. The Babylonian tablet combined geography with a broader conception of the world. The Turin Papyrus turned desert terrain and useful stone into practical information. And Saint-Bélec may have transformed a Bronze Age landscape into political territory. They are different objects solving different problems, which means that the phrase maps that should not exist has been misleading from the beginning. They should exist. The real question is why they look impossible to us. And to answer that, we need to look not at one final mysterious coastline, but at what happened between the person who first knew something and the map that happened to survive. At the beginning of this journey, the mystery seemed simple. How could an old map show something its maker was not supposed to know? After 10 maps, that question has become much harder to ask. Because there was never just one way for knowledge to reach a map, a coastline might come from direct observation, another might be copied from an older chart, a third could arrive through merchants or sailors. A continent might be drawn because scholars believed one ought to exist. An island might begin as a navigational mistake and survive because later cartographers trusted the first map. A genuine geographical tradition could be attached to a forged object. And sometimes a mapmaker could make an intelligent inference that happened to resemble what later explorers would confirm. All of these things could appear on the same sheet of parchment with exactly the same confidence of line. That is what makes old maps so easy to misunderstand. Ink does not tell us how certain the person holding the pen was. The line remains. The hesitation disappears. Consider Friesland again. For generations, the Phantom Island occupied the North Atlantic on respectable European maps. Once enough cartographers reproduced it, its presence began to look like independent confirmation. But several maps repeating the same mistake do not create several witnesses. They create a lineage. The error has ancestors. The same principle works in the opposite direction. If a surviving map contains accurate information, that information may also have ancestors. The person whose name appears on the map may be several generations removed from the person who first observed the coast. This is perhaps the most important correction to the idea of the impossible map. We naturally ask how the mapmaker knew. Often, the mapmaker did not know in the way we mean. He inherited. Piri Reis tells us this more openly than most. His 1513 map was assembled from other maps. Some reflected recent Iberian voyages, some belonged to older traditions. The surviving object is therefore less like a single eyewitness statement and more like a conversation between sources. The same basic process can operate over much greater distances. The Kangnido did not require Korean sailors to round southern Africa. Geographical knowledge connected to the Islamic world could enter Mongol and Chinese intellectual networks, become incorporated into maps there, and eventually reach Korean scholars. No single traveller needed to complete the entire journey. The information travelled in stages. This is how human networks accomplish things that can look impossible when we search for one heroic individual. A merchant carries a name. A scholar copies a shape. A translator changes the sound of the name. A court acquires a map. A copyist preserves it. Another mapmaker combines it with something else. Eventually, a coastline appears thousands of kilometres from the people who first knew it. The route disappears. The coastline remains. Centuries later, we mistake the missing route for missing technology. Sometimes there really was a missing map. This is not speculation in the broad sense. Lost documents are an ordinary condition of history. Paper burns. Papyrus decays. Parchment is cut up and reused. Ink fades. Libraries are looted. Archives are scattered. Ships sink. Charts used at sea are exposed to water, handling, folding, and constant wear. A document can disappear because someone decided it was no longer useful. Nothing dramatic needs to happen. One spring cleaning can destroy history very efficiently. This creates an enormous imbalance between what once existed and what we can now examine. Waldseemüller's 1507 world map provides a striking example. An edition of roughly 1,000 copies is believed to have been printed. Only one copy of that edition is known to survive. 1,000 to 1. Now imagine that the final copy had also disappeared. We would still know something of Waldseemüller's work through related material, but one of the most extraordinary visual documents of the early 16th century geographical revolution would be gone. The Pacific-like ocean west of the Americas would not be available to us in the same way. The first famous printed use of the name America on that map would become harder to experience directly. One accident of preservation changes what later centuries are able to ask. This is why the surviving record can make the past look emptier than it was. We see one map and imagine one map. There may once have been a workshop full of them. We see one geographical idea and imagine a sudden breakthrough. It may have circulated for decades in documents that disappeared. But caution has to work in both directions. Lost maps certainly existed. That does not mean we can invent a lost map whenever we need one. There is a large difference between saying Piri Reis used earlier charts, some of which no longer survive, and saying, therefore one of those charts must have been produced by an unknown civilization that mapped Antarctica thousands of years earlier. The first statement follows the evidence. The second adds an entire civilization to fill a gap. History is full of gaps. A gap is not automatically evidence of whatever fits inside it. This is where several famous impossible map claims begin to weaken. Oronce finds enormous southern continent seems astonishing because Antarctica actually exists. But people had imagined a great southern land before they possessed observational knowledge of Antarctica. The map can therefore be explained through the geographical ideas of its own period. Jave la Grande on the Dieppe maps is tantalizing because Portuguese sailors were already operating in Southeast Asian waters and could, in principle, have reached Australia before the documented Dutch voyages. That possibility deserves serious consideration. But possibility is not proof. A coastline that can be made to resemble Australia after rotation and adjustment does not establish a secret Portuguese survey. Resemblance needs context. Place names matter. Source traditions matter. Projection matters. Mismatches matter just as much as matches. This is especially important because coastlines are excellent raw material for pattern recognition. They are complicated, irregular, full of bays, points, bends, and protrusions. Give someone two sufficiently complex shapes and enough freedom to rotate, stretch, crop, or rescale one of them, and meaningful-looking correspondences become surprisingly easy to produce. The mind likes completion. It likes patterns. Map mysteries often exploit both. This does not mean every strange resemblance is meaningless. It means visual similarity should begin an investigation, not end one. The Vinland Map gives us an even sharper warning. For years, the object seemed capable of providing extraordinary documentary support for pre-Columbian Norse knowledge of North America. The underlying historical event was real. Norse people really reached North America centuries before Columbus. Archaeology proved it. The map did not. The map was a modern forgery. There is something almost elegant about the contradiction. Truth does not make every piece of evidence offered in its support true. A genuine event can attract false evidence. In fact, genuine events may attract especially persuasive false evidence because the story surrounding the object already makes sense. That is why evidence has to be tested independently of whether we like the conclusion. The parchment may be old. The ink may not be. The story may be true. The artifact may still be false. And then there is Waldseemüller. His 1507 map remains different because even after the grander claims are removed, a genuine uncertainty survives. He represented the Western lands as separate from Asia and left an ocean beyond South America before Balboa's documented sighting of the Pacific from the Americas. Inference may explain it. Unknown or incompletely reconstructed sources may have contributed. We cannot confidently rebuild every step, and that is acceptable. Not every historical question has to end with a dramatic answer. Sometimes the correct ending is a narrower uncertainty. We know what the map shows. We know much of the intellectual environment in which it was produced. We have plausible explanations. We do not possess the complete source chain. That is not a failure. It is simply where the evidence stops. For much of human history, the evidence stopped frequently. Knowledge was fragile. Even practical geographical knowledge could live inside people rather than documents. A pilot knew how to approach a harbour. A fisherman knew where currents changed. A caravan leader knew which route remained passable after rain. A shepherd knew where water could be found. A local community knew where one territory ended and another began. Not all of this needed to become a map. Oral geography can be extremely detailed, but it is difficult for historians to recover because when the people carrying it disappear, the archive disappears with them. The Saint-Bélec Slab gives us a glimpse of what may happen when some of that spatial understanding becomes physical. If the cartographic interpretation is correct, a Bronze Age landscape was carved into stone. The rivers still exist. The terrain can still be studied, but the people who understood every mark are gone. We can scan the surface with instruments they could never have imagined and still know less about its meaning than someone standing beside it 4,000 years ago. The technology has improved. The context has vanished. The Turin Papyrus presents almost the reverse situation. Its purpose is more legible. Routes, wadis, quarrying areas, and different geological materials were important because people had practical work to perform in a harsh environment. Its maker did not need a theory of plate tectonics to distinguish useful stone. Need produces knowledge. A worker who must find a resource becomes attentive to distinctions that someone merely passing through can ignore. A sailor who must survive a reef learns a coastline differently from a scholar who only reads about it. This helps explain why some ancient and early maps are surprisingly detailed in very specific ways. People became accurate where accuracy paid. A Mediterranean port could be carefully represented while a distant continent remained fantastical. A desert route could be functionally useful while its geometry was simplified. A river system could matter more than the precise shape of surrounding hills. Modern viewers sometimes interpret these uneven maps as evidence that their makers possessed fragments of advanced knowledge. In a sense, they did possess fragments, but there is nothing mysterious about the fragmentation. Different people knew different things. The world had not yet been standardized into one geographical database. There was no authoritative global map waiting in the background. There were overlapping maps, overlapping memories, overlapping traditions, and sometimes they disagreed. Imagine the practical consequences for a navigator, not as a dramatic reconstruction, but as a simple condition of work. He has a chart. He also has the horizon. The two do not quite agree. Which one should he trust? A map carries authority because someone took the trouble to draw it, but the sea has the final vote. If an island fails to appear where the chart says it should, the navigator does not immediately know whether the island is false or his position is wrong. Without reliable longitude, that uncertainty could persist for a long time. The problem becomes worse at night. A coastline that would be obvious in daylight may be invisible. A reef can announce itself only through breaking water. Cloud can remove celestial reference points. Bad weather can push a vessel away from the route its crew believes it is following. Maps were useful precisely because the world was dangerous. But danger also made maps difficult to correct. This is how phantom geography could survive. Not because earlier people were unusually gullible, because verification was expensive. To prove an island did not exist, someone might need to search a large area of ocean accurately enough to be confident that the map, rather than the ship's estimated position, was wrong. That takes time. Time requires provisions. Provisions require money. A ruler or merchant needs a reason to pay. An imaginary island can survive quite comfortably when nobody has a profitable reason to disprove it. There is a dry little lesson in that. Errors do not always survive because people love errors. Sometimes correcting them is simply inconvenient. And once an error enters an authoritative source, another human habit protects it. Copying is safer than omission. Suppose you are making a new map and an older respected chart contains an island you have never personally confirmed. If you include it and the island turns out not to exist, you have repeated an accepted mistake. If you remove it and the island turns out to be real, you have deliberately removed potentially valuable information. The conservative choice is obvious. Leave the island. So, the phantom survives another generation. This process is not confined to cartography. Human institutions accumulate inherited information because deleting old knowledge can feel riskier than adding new knowledge. Maps simply make the process visible, and maps have another quality that makes their errors unusually persuasive. They look decisive. A written traveller can say, "I was told that an island may lie somewhere to the west." That sentence contains uncertainty. Draw the island, and uncertainty acquires a coastline. Give it a name, and it acquires identity. Add mountains, and it begins to acquire personality. The visual form makes rumour feel solid. Perhaps that is one reason impossible maps remain so attractive today. We know intellectually that old cartographers made mistakes, but the line is still there. We can see it. And seeing carries its own kind of authority. That is why the best way to approach these maps is neither cynical nor credulous. We do not need to laugh at earlier map makers for being wrong. They were often solving extraordinarily difficult problems with limited information. Nor do we need to transform every unexpected coastline into evidence of a vanished technological age. Between those extremes lies a much richer human world. Sailors crossing seas without knowing precisely where they were. Merchants carrying names from one language into another. Scholars trying to reconcile classical texts with new voyages. Governments attempting to keep charts secret. Enemies capturing them. Copyists preserving both discoveries and mistakes. Mapmakers filling blank spaces because leaving them blank felt intellectually unsatisfying. People drawing continents they believed should exist. Others discovering continents that millions of human beings already inhabited. And everywhere, information travelling farther than the person who first possessed it. This is what the 10 maps ultimately reveal. Not a single lost civilization, not one hidden archive from which every impossible coastline descended. Something less tidy and more human. Knowledge has always moved unevenly. It can travel enormous distances and still arrive incomplete. It can survive for centuries while its origin disappears. It can be copied accurately and interpreted badly. It can be copied badly and preserve something true. It can be lost in one region while remaining ordinary knowledge somewhere else. And it can vanish almost completely, leaving one surviving object that makes later generations wonder how anyone could have known. So if we return to that first question tonight, how could an old map show something no one was supposed to know yet? There is no single answer. Sometimes they did not know, they guessed. Sometimes the coastline has been misidentified by modern viewers. Sometimes the map is simply wrong. Sometimes it is forged. Sometimes the information came from another culture. Sometimes the mapmaker inherited an older source. And sometimes, as with parts of Waldseemüller's extraordinary 1507 world, we can narrow the possibilities without recovering the complete answer. That small remainder of uncertainty is worth keeping. History does not become less interesting when we admit what we do not know. It becomes more precise and perhaps more beautiful, because somewhere behind every surviving map is a much larger vanished world of information. Charts that no longer exist, journeys that were never written down, place names spoken in ports and forgotten, copies made from copies, routes memorized by people whose names never entered a chronicle, a line drawn by someone who had seen a coast, another line drawn by someone who had only heard about it, a third added because the mapmaker believed the world needed land there. Centuries later, all 3 lines may look equally certain. The parchment cannot explain itself. The clay remains silent. The carved stone gives us no legend. We have to reconstruct the human chain behind them. And when we do, the impossible maps become possible. Not ordinary, certainly not unimpressive. If anything, they become more remarkable, because the explanation does not require people in the distant past to possess satellites, aircraft, or forgotten machines. It requires something they certainly did possess: curiosity, memory, observation, trade, travel, imperfect communication, a willingness to copy what someone else knew, and the persistent human desire to understand what lay beyond the next horizon. Long before anyone could photograph the Earth from space, people were already trying to hold the world in their hands. sometimes on parchment, sometimes on papyrus, sometimes in clay, sometimes carved into stone. The maps were incomplete because their world was incomplete to them. They were distorted because knowledge arrived unevenly, and every so often, one of those maps preserved a fragment that travelled farther or survived longer than anyone might reasonably expect. That is why, centuries later, the line can still surprise us. The person who drew it is gone. The traveller who first carried the information may be gone even from memory. The original source may have disappeared, but the line remains. And for tonight at least, that is enough.